when we're talking about Ukraine, I think the complicated thing is that there's a lot of things happening at the same time. Some things are about Ukraine, some things seem to be about Ukraine, but are they really? Like the fact that we're militarizing at rapid speed in Europe, that we want to ramp up military budgets, some say even to 5% of GDP. Are those really about Ukraine? I actually doubt it. I think they are much more about imperialism, and Ukraine is kind of used as an excuse or as a pretext to ramp up those military budgets. So for that reason, I'll first talk a bit more generally about imperialism and the role of NATO in there, and I'll only talk towards the end more specifically about the case of Ukraine. So let me start with the idea that Europe supposedly and NATO supposedly feels threatened by Russia. And this is why we need to, add another 800 billion to the budget. Well, if we look here to the right, I'm not sure if everybody can see it, but the US-led military bloc basically spends about 3/4 of global military spending. Even if we would take out the United States, even if we have, sometimes they say no, but Russia has cheap personnel costs and things like that. Even if we correct for price differences, we take out the United States, NATO plus Ukraine is still spending 3 times more on the military than Russia. And also, very basically, if we look at the main dynamics on the battlefield in Ukraine, basically after 3 years of major warfare, what Russia conquered in Ukraine, and that's even including Crimea, which wasn't really conquered in conventional military warfare, it would still be equal to 2% of NATO European territory. So, in this context, is it really logical that we would see Russian tanks on the footsteps of Amsterdam anytime soon? I do not think so. And actually, we've been here before. We've been here before when NATO was founded. When NATO was founded in 1949, just before, you had a very similar war scare, the idea that the Soviet Union was about to invade any second now. It was, on all the radio waves. And there's a decent book about it. It's called Harry Truman and the War Scare of 1948. And it looks in much detail in all the actual declassified files of the intelligence agencies. And unanimously, they concluded at the time that the Soviet Union had no plans whatsoever to invade Europe. It was just a complete propaganda campaign. The real goal was to foster an anti-communist and imperialist alliance under the aegis of US leadership. Obviously, it was a very clearly anti-communist alliance, but it was founded by the major colonizers of its day, like Great Britain, like the Netherlands, like France, like even fascist states like Portugal under the Estado Novo at the time. All these countries were engaged in major imperial warfares, slaughtering millions at the time. And actually the model of NATO was also a model that was exported across the globe, because it wasn't only about Europe, right? So they had a very similar Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, better known as SEATO. They had a Middle East Treaty Organization, or the NATO, that the Organization of American States, and all of them were filled with right-wing dictatorships, with colonizers, like the Middle East Treaty Organization. Britain was still like a major colonial power in the region at the time. They had Pakistan in there, which was committing genocide in what would later become Bangladesh, killing about 1 million people. And in fact, SEATO was used specifically also to justify the US invasion of Vietnam, because they said, we have we have the NATO Article 5 treaty, attack against one is an attack against all. They said the same about South Vietnam, and then, we have to invade to protect our ally, which was, of course, also a major dictatorship. That's the basic context. And as the book Endless Holocaust details, actually, the US-led wars and backed dictatorships and extermination campaigns and execution campaigns led to about 33 million deaths during the so-called Cold War. So it was not, in fact, a Cold War. It was a very hot war, and it was aimed primarily at anti-colonial and socialist movements against the global South. It was much less actually about the Soviet Union. Yes, the Soviet Union gave finance, gave weapons, but by and large it was not fought by them. In fact, the most concrete military solidarity was given by Cuba, a country of about 10 million people, when they fought with the people of Africa against apartheid in the entire South African region. So, yeah, this is how Amilcar Cabral, who was actually from that region, he was fighting against Portuguese colonialism, which was going all the way up into the 70s. This is how he described NATO. He said, NATO is the USA. We have captured in our country many US weapons. NATO is the Federal Republic of Germany. We have a lot of Mauser rifles taken from Portuguese soldiers. NATO, for the time being at least, is France. In our country, there are Aralez helicopters. NATO is, to a certain extent, the government of that heroic people which has given so many examples of love of freedom, the Italian people. Yes, we have captured from the Portuguese machine guns and grenades made in Italy. So you see that NATO is really meant to, after a period of time, because before World War II, you know, the imperialists were constantly fighting each other, the major example also being, of course, World War I. But after World War II, socialist forces were on the rise across the globe, anti-colonialist forces were on the rise across the globe, partially also because they had a leading role in anti-fascist struggle, partially also because European powers were weakened because of World War II, and in that context they thought they had to unite more strongly as a kind of coherent imperialist bloc, and this is exactly what we see NATO is doing. So the basic context of imperialism is that it drains labor, resources, energy, and land from the global south year in and year out to feed basically the corporate profits of the global north. And this has continued to this day. In fact, it has exploded even after the fall of socialism and kind of US unipolar hegemony. And you see that here, the drain from the global south, and this is measured through unequal exchange, only exploded in the 90s. And it's about, the unequal trade is about so much that you could wipe out extreme poverty 70 times over. You can also measure this in like biophysical terms, like looking at how much, you know, labor and land use in products go in and out through trade, and then you find that unequal trade is so high that the land and the energy would be enough to give basically 6.5 billion people their basic human rights, such as housing, such as education, such as food. So we are talking about really huge numbers, and this is what the military violence of the NATO alliance is meant to protect. And the context also of that anti-communism, and this is, I think, important to understand, is that the anti-colonial struggle, obviously not all were communists, but at least all of them had some form of socialism. They had some form of wanting affordable housing, affordable care, taking back their economies, nationalizing the industries. This was the mainstream. Even people like Sukarno, who, you know, had also tensions with communist movements. You had the Madjun affair, of course. But even someone like him also said, you know, my ideology is a combination of Islam, communism, and nationalism. So this was the mainstream, and we also see basically, and this is even if we look at IMF, World Bank data, which are like the arch capitalist institutions of the world, that we see that if you compare countries at similar levels of GDP, just basic life expectancy, doctors per capita, and all those kind of really basic structures show that socialist countries were performing much better. And even anarchists like Noam Chomsky, who are no fan at all of the Soviet Union, but they also give, and I'm not going to read out the whole quote for the interest of time, but basically he summarizes the record of declassified files from the US government, from the UK government, and what's really clear is that they were not fearing repression, they were not fearing authoritarianism. In fact, sometimes they were working together with them, with Pol Pot, for example. No, what they were fearing was the successes, was the free healthcare, was the fact that there was housing. That is what they were fearing, because it threatened to break the entire colonial arrangement in the global south. So the role of NATO is also to basically create a framework for the interoperability of armies. So you also make sure that the arms industries become integrated. It is also a blatant aggressive alliance in some cases, like the occupation of Afghanistan, the invasion of Libya literally happened under the NATO alliance. Interesting case, if we're talking about NATO expansion into Eastern Europe, is that, you know, even in that context, it's not actually defensive. If we look, for example, at the US invasion of Iraq, it was very, very unpopular across Europe, even in the United States. And for that reason, some European leaders in Germany and France had some mild criticism. Honestly, it wasn't good enough. They were more like about, UN Security Council clearance and stuff like that. But still, they had some critique. And then Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld says, when he's critiqued about, you don't have NATO on your side, he says, well, now you're thinking of Europe as Germany and France. I think that's the old Europe. If you look at the entire NATO Europe today, the center of gravity is shifting to the east, and then basically he goes on how they are supporting them. And the Polish foreign minister at the time in 2003 literally said openly, we have never hidden our desire for Polish oil companies to finally have access to sources of commodities. So NATO is about integrating new countries within the imperialist bloc. It is not actually about defense. People do have a right to defense, but NATO is not the architecture that is meant for that. So is there actually a rift within NATO? Well, right now, of course, with Trump, this is what people are saying, and that's why we have to ramp up defense expenditure. Well, I already gave you the numbers, but I'm actually even very skeptical about the idea that there's any significant rift at all. In fact, when I was writing the book, we had very similar hysteria in 2016. And in fact, Trump was very consistent at the time. He said, if only as a threat, like stepping out of NATO, etc., if you do not ramp up defense spending. The main goal is to actually militarize NATO, not to abolish NATO, and 2/3 of the weapons expenditure of European NATO countries actually come from the United States. So it's a bit ridiculous that you think you are going to be independent by ramping up military expenditures, which are literally feeding the war machine in the United States that is invading countries across the globe. And even this very idea that there's like this kind of, authoritarian alliance between Trump and Putin, I don't think that's going to be consistent at all. I won't get too much into that, but even the basic numbers, if we look at, for example, data from Freedom House, which is literally US government funded, so this is like their terms, then basically 75% of dictators in the world also received military backing from Joe Biden. And actually before that, from Obama, from Bush, from Trump. Before that, it's very consistent and it's very bipartisan. And yeah, I'm actually going to run short of time, which is annoying, because I should have talked more about Ukraine. I think I'm gonna stick to this slide maybe only then, and not go into the whole history. If you do want to get into the whole history of like the last, basically since 2014, we can get into that into the discussion maybe. But I think the most important question now is about what the right metaphor is to understand Ukraine, right? I think most Western imperialists, most people who want to justify endless more expenditure for NATO, want to compare it basically to World War II. They say anyone calling for peace is like, Munich is like appeasing the Nazis all over again. I think the more accurate comparison would be to World War I. Because what we actually see is that the ideological differences, the economic differences, the basic structures of both enemies are not that large. In fact, Putin used to be a big friend of the Western world. He was the follow-up of Yeltsin, who, Bill Clinton compared even to Abraham Lincoln because he was privatizing everything and they loved it. And when they were bombing Chechnya, it was all fine because it was our ally. And when Putin was bombing Chechnya, actually in the early 2000s, he got standing ovations in the German parliament. George Bush Jr. was, saying he looked into his eyes and he saw his soul and he's a very decent man. Tony Blair from the Labour Party, so it was not just the right wing, was saying very similar things. So the real tensions with Russia was really because Russia feared, especially from the invasion of Iraq, that like many allies, because Saddam Hussein, of course, in Iraq used to also be an ally, that he might be next. And basically that's why tensions ramped up, and he would have liked to play ball, but basically the West did not really allow him and just kept expanding NATO to their borders. So Ukraine itself, of course, is a victim of aggression. I'm not going to get too much into the civil war before. I do think actually Ukraine at that time was more of an aggressor, but after 2022, the war zone by Russia expanded massively also into zones where there's no significant separatism. I think that's illegal, I think that's criminal, but to say that diplomacy is impossible is a bit ridiculous when, in fact, for example, if Putin always wanted to invade Ukraine, and that was always the plan, why, for example, in the 1st of March 2014, when literally then the legal president of Ukraine, Yanukovych, sent a letter to Putin asking him to intervene, he said no. When before that there was an accord for with the opposition in Ukraine to build a government of national unity and to hold new elections. It was negotiated with European leaders, including Polish European leaders. Actually, the Polish Foreign Minister, Sikorski, literally said that it was Putin who pressured Yanukovych to sign the agreement. When the rebels, year in, year out, asked for Russia to annex Donbass, he refused. In fact, the Minsk agreements were there for 8 years. It was Russia that actually put it into the UN Security Council for clearance and that supported it. So I can go on, but honestly, there's so many examples where there was a diplomatic solution possible. It is very clear that the main issue for Russia is NATO expansion, and it's very clear that the negotiated solution is possible in that context. So Ukraine is waging a defensive war, which is legitimate, but I get a little bit annoyed when people compare it to the anti-colonial struggles and the national liberation struggles of the colonized world. As I said before, those always had a social revolutionary content. They were also tied into an international structure of revolution. If it was not Bandung, then even the more progressive side was at the Tricontinental Conference in Cuba, for example. It was tied to world revolution. We see the exact opposite in Ukraine. We see Zelensky saying that he sees Israel as an example. We see him saying that they are justified in violating international law because you cannot deal otherwise with terrorists. We see them voting to support the embargo against Cuba. We see them voting against a new economic order to get more fair trade into the world economy. We see them applying very extensive economic shock doctrine within Ukraine, privatizations, freezing of minimum wages, slashing healthcare, slashing education budgets. This is not the kind of policy that national liberation governments do. In fact...
So, I'm going to stop you there, because I know you.
No, I'm going to last sentence.
Last sentence.
In fact, this is also how the Ukrainian government itself understands itself. Like literally, like the Kiev Independent recently published an article comparing themselves to South Vietnam. Like the puppet dictator backed by the US to invade Vietnam. And they compared Trump to, the United States pulling out in 75. They understand themselves as part of the Western imperialist world. This is very explicit, and this is very clear, and it's very naive for leftists to think any other way.